There is a hill in southeastern Turkey that holds the oldest giant stone monuments ever raised by human hands, and almost none of it has ever been dug up. It is called Gobekli Tepe. Stone circles were built around 11,600 years ago by hunter-gatherers who had no farms, no writing, and no metal tools, none of the things the textbook said you needed to build anything at all. It is older than Stonehenge by about 6,000 years, and older than the pyramids of Egypt by about 7,000. And almost everything you have ever seen about this place comes from a sliver of it. The famous carved pillars in every photograph, the ones standing under that steel roof, are barely 5% of the site. The other 95% is still underground, exactly where it was left. And the AI everyone is arguing about right now, Elon Musk's Grok, has been turned loose on the scans of that hill, pulling the buried shapes straight out of the data. But the strangest part came long before any of that. The people who built this place did not simply lose it to time. They buried it themselves on purpose, packing their own monument under tons of earth and rubble by hand. And 12,000 years later, the people who control the site have quietly made the same decision: leave it in the ground. So this is the story of what is hidden under Göbekli Tepe, what the scans have actually found down there, and why a growing number of people are now convinced the most important dig on Earth has been deliberately shut down. To understand why that matters, we have to go back to the moment Göbekli Tepe wrecked archaeology in the first place. For most of the 20th century, the story of how civilization began was treated as settled. The textbook version went like this. First, humans learned to farm. Farming produced surplus food. Surplus food let people settle in one place and form villages. Villages grew into towns, and only once people had spare time and spare resources did they start building temples, inventing religion, and raising monuments. Agriculture first, everything else after. It was clean, it was logical, and it had been accepted as fact for generations. Göbekli Tepe wrecked it, because the people who raised these stone enclosures had no farms at all. They were hunter-gatherers, nomads living off wild plants and wild animals, and somehow these supposedly simple foragers quarried, carved, hauled, and stood up limestone pillars weighing as much as 10 tons, arranged them into deliberate circles, and covered them in skilled art. They did all of it before agriculture existed, which leaves a question that still has no comfortable answer. If they had no farms and no permanent settlements, how and why did they build the most ambitious structure of the ancient world? And what else did they leave behind that we still have not seen? The discovery itself is almost as strange as the site. In 1963, a joint survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University walked across this exact hill. They saw broken pieces of limestone and the tops of a few large stones poking out of the dirt, decided they were medieval grave markers, wrote it down as a boring old cemetery, and moved on. For the next 30 years, the most important archaeological site on the planet sat untouched under a farmer's field, with nobody realizing what it was. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to take another look. Schmidt had read those old survey notes, but when he stood on the hill and examined the stones himself, he understood within minutes that everyone before him had been wrong. These were not gravestones. The shaped limestone, the worked surfaces, the sheer scale of what was buried in the mound, all of it told him he was standing on something far older and far bigger than anyone had guessed. He later said he had two choices that day: walk away or spend the rest of his life there. He stayed. Excavations began the following year, in 1995, and almost immediately, the hill started giving up things that should not have existed. What Schmidt's team pulled out of the ground were huge circular and oval enclosures, ringed by T-shaped limestone pillars. The largest of them stand as tall as 18 feet and weigh many tons each. In the center of every circle stand two even larger pillars facing one another, and these central stones are not blank. They have arms carved down their sides, hands meeting at the front, belts and loincloths represented in the stone. They are stylized human figures, or something more than human, towering and faceless, standing guard in the middle of each ring. And carved across the surrounding stone is a whole bestiary rendered with startling skill. Snarling foxes, wild boar, coiled snakes, scorpions, vultures with their wings spread, cranes and ducks and aurochs. This was confident, deliberate art, carved by the people the textbooks had written off as primitive cavemen. Carbon dating put the oldest layers at around 9,600 years before the Common Era, 11,500 years ago. In one stroke, Schmidt had found the oldest monumental sanctuary ever discovered, and he had blown a hole straight through the accepted story of how human society advanced. His summary of what it meant was short, and to the old model, devastating. First came the temple, he said. Then came the city. And what it took to build this is hard to wrap your head around. These people had no wheel, no carts, no animals trained to haul heavy loads, no metal tools of any kind. To raise Gobekli Tepe, they had to cut massive blocks of limestone out of the bedrock using nothing but harder stones, shape them into precise T-shaped pillars, then drag those multi-ton monoliths across the landscape and stand them upright in carefully planned circles with human muscle, rope, and stubbornness alone. A single one of the biggest pillars would have needed dozens of people working together, maybe hundreds, and every one of those people had to be fed. The fill packed inside the enclosures is full of the bones of wild animals, gazelle and aurochs, and more, the leftovers of feasts on a scale that points to large crowds gathering at the site, probably at certain times of year, to build, to worship, and to eat together. Some researchers have even found hints that those gatherings involved an early fermented drink, a possible ancestor of beer brewed in big stone vessels. This was organized, sustained, communal labor by people with no kings, no government, and not a single written plan. How they pulled it off is still one of the great puzzles of the ancient world. But the deeper the team dug, the stranger the place got. Because the part that still baffles archaeologists is not the building itself. It is what the builders did once they were finished. They buried it. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were not knocked down by an earthquake or swallowed by drifting sand or simply left to collapse over the centuries. By the leading reading of the evidence, the people who built each enclosure eventually and deliberately filled it in by hand. They packed the stone circles with rubble, with broken tools, with soil, and with the bones from enormous feasts until the whole structure was sealed under an artificial mound. Then, in many cases, they built a new enclosure nearby, sometimes directly on top, and in time they buried that one too. This is exactly why the carvings survived in such good condition for 11,000 years. They were never exposed to wind and weather. They were entombed, protected by the very fill that hid them. But it leaves us with a question nobody has truly answered. Why would people pour years of labor into a monument, use it, and then bury their own masterpiece? Was it a ritual of closure, a way of retiring a sacred space once its purpose was done? Was each generation symbolically putting the old world to rest before raising the next? Was it tied to death, to the dead, to some belief about the underworld we will never reconstruct? We still don't know. The burial is one of the central mysteries of the site, and not everyone even agrees on how that burial happened. The classic interpretation, the one Schmidt championed, is that the fill was placed deliberately in a single intentional act of closure for each enclosure. Other researchers think the picture is messier, that some of the fill may have built up more gradually, and that the enclosures might not have been open-air temples at all. One serious suggestion is that at least some of these structures were roofed buildings, even houses where people lived and worked rather than ceremonial spaces visited only on rare occasions. That idea cuts hard against Schmidt's original vision of a pure sanctuary with no permanent population. and it feeds straight into one of the longest-running arguments about the entire site. Did anyone actually live at Gobekli Tepe, or did they only gather here and then leave? For years, the apparent lack of ordinary domestic remains pointed to the second answer. But that assumption, as we are about to see, has very recently started to crack. It is also the first hint of a pattern that repeats itself in our own lifetime near the end of this story. But before we get there, we have to grasp just how much of Gobekli Tepe is still down there, because the part that has been excavated, the part the whole world has seen, is almost nothing. Klaus Schmidt understood this better than anyone because he was the one who measured it. Instead of digging blindly, Schmidt and his team used technology to see into the hill without disturbing it. They used ground-penetrating radar, which fires radio waves into the earth and reads what bounces back. And they used geomagnetic survey methods, which detect buried structures by their magnetic signatures. They mapped the entire summit, and the surveys came back with a number that is genuinely hard to believe. Schmidt charted at least 16 more stone enclosures still buried across the mound. On top of the handful his team had begun to dig. The site sprawls across roughly 22 acres, and the area that had actually been excavated added up to less than 5% of the whole. Schmidt himself said archaeologists could keep digging at Göbekli Tepe for another 50 years and still barely scratch the surface, which means every documentary you have ever watched, every photo of those iconic carved pillars, every artist's reconstruction, all of it is built on one tiny corner of the site. The famous enclosures, the ones labeled with letters in the reports, are not even a sixth of what the radar says is waiting underground. Beneath the visitors walking the wooden platforms, beneath the gift shop and the parking area and the surrounding fields, lie at least a dozen more giant circles that no living person has ever laid eyes on. Stone giants standing in the dark, exactly where the builders left them, sealed in their artificial tombs for over 11,000 years. The map exists, the targets are marked, and almost none of it has been opened. So the obvious question is, in an age of advanced technology, why not just look? That brings us to the part of this story that sounds like science fiction and is completely real. For most of the history of archaeology, the only way to know what was inside a site like this was to dig. And digging is slow, expensive, and permanent. Once you remove the earth, you can never put the context back. So over the past 2 decades, researchers have leaned harder and harder on a different approach, seeing through the ground without breaking it. The radar and magnetic survey Schmidt pioneered have grown far more sophisticated, and in recent years, a new tool has joined them: artificial intelligence. Systems like Elon Musk's Grok are built to do one thing extremely well: find structure inside enormous, messy piles of data far faster and far more thoroughly than any human team working by hand. And subsurface scans of a place like Gobekli Tepe produce exactly that kind of data. Thousands of overlapping radar readings, magnetic gradients, and elevation measurements that are almost impossible for a person to read by eye. Feed that data to a model like Grok, built to recognize patterns, and the buried architecture starts to resolve out of the noise, walls, circles, the unmistakable geometry of enclosures. And here is what matters. When the real scan data from Gobekli Tepe gets run through a system like that, you are not guessing about what might be there. You are reading a map of what is there. The AI does not need to believe in lost civilizations or ancient mysteries. It just reports the shapes hidden under the soil. And those shapes confirm in hard data what Schmidt suspected. This hill is packed with unexcavated structure. The visible site is the tip of something enormous, but there is a hard limit to what any scan can do, and it sits right at the center of this whole frustration. Radar and magnetic surveys can reveal the outline of a buried structure, its shape, its size, its position, the geometry of its walls. What they cannot do is show you what is inside it. They cannot read a carving. They cannot recover a tool, a bone, a seed, or a fragment of art. They cannot date a layer or tell you what the people who used the structure actually did in it. For that, there is still only one method in all of archaeology: You have to dig. So the scans leave us in a maddening spot. We can see with real confidence that more than a dozen giant enclosures lie under this hill, mapped and located and named on the surveys. We are simply not opening them, and the picture is still growing. As recently as October of 2025, an international research team turned ground-penetrating radar on the eastern and southern slopes of the mound, areas that had barely been examined before. The trigger was almost mundane. Olive trees that had long covered those slopes were finally cleared, letting the scanners reach them for the first time. The results, in the words of the researchers, were highly exciting. The radar picked up more circular monumental enclosures. It picked up a large building, and it picked up smaller structures that may have been early domestic dwellings, hinting that people did not just gather here, they may have lived here, which would reshape the debate all over again. The excavation director, Necmi Karul of Istanbul University and Barbara Herreyes of the Austrian Archaeological Institute confirmed the team was finally able to take full measurements of the entire site and begin marking out its true boundaries. So in late 2025, the scans did not shrink the mystery. They made it bigger. Every time someone points modern instruments at this hill, the hill answers with more. And still, the standard response is not to dig and find out what those newly detected structures hold. It is to map them, photograph the data, and leave them sealed. Which is strange enough on its own, but Göbekli Tepe is not even the whole story. Because what the scanning has revealed is that this single hill is just one node in something much, much larger. Göbekli Tepe does not stand alone. Spread across the surrounding region of southeastern Turkey is a whole constellation of sites from the same lost world, built by the same kind of people in the same astonishing window of time. Archaeologists have grouped them under one banner, the Stone Hills, in Turkish, Tas Tepeler. At least a dozen of these sites have now been identified. The most famous after Göbekli Tepe is Karahan Tepe, a sister site some distance away that has produced its own carved pillars, its own enclosures, and some haunting finds, including a chamber full of phallic pillars cut from the bedrock and a human face emerging straight out of the stone wall. Karahan Tepe may be just as old as Göbekli Tepe, possibly older. There, archaeologists uncovered a room carved directly down into the bedrock, rows of tall pillars rising from the rock floor, and a single carved human head set into the wall. Its face turned to gaze across the chamber as if standing watch over whatever happened inside. It is one of the eeriest spaces ever found from this period of human history, and it had been sealed and hidden for thousands of years, exactly like the enclosures at its more famous neighbor. The Turkish authorities have since launched a formal, long-term research program built around all of these sites, named after the stone hills themselves, meant to study the whole region as one connected phenomenon for years to come. But studying and scanning is not the same as excavating. Across the entire region, site after site, the same pattern holds. A glimpse uncovered and the rest left underground. And like Göbekli Tepe, the overwhelming majority of it stays unexcavated. Step back and look at the whole region, and the implication is hard to take in. This was not a single isolated temple built by a single isolated group. This was a whole buried culture, spread across the landscape, raising giant stone architecture again and again over many centuries, at a moment in prehistory when the textbooks insist humans were incapable of anything close. An entire chapter of the human story, written in carved limestone and still almost completely buried. We are not talking about one mystery on one hill. We are talking about a lost civilization, glimpsed through a handful of trenches, with the rest left in the dark. And the questions it raises are exactly the kind the buried 95% might finally answer, which is what makes the next part of the story so frustrating and, to some people, so suspicious. Because Göbekli Tepe is full of unanswered questions, and the answers may well be sitting in the parts no one will excavate. Who organized the labor to build these enclosures if there were no kings, no cities, no state? How did hunter-gatherers feed the work crews during construction when there were no farms? What did the T-shaped figures represent, and who or what were the central twin pillars meant to be? What do the animals mean, the vultures and scorpions and snakes carved so carefully into the stone? Some researchers have pushed these questions much further than mainstream archaeology is comfortable with. One contested theory focuses on a single carved stone, often called the vulture stone, listed in the reports as Pillar 43. A group of researchers argued that its arrangement of animals and symbols is actually a record of a catastrophic comet impact around the end of the last ice age, a disaster tied to a climate event called the Younger Dryas. In that reading, Göbekli Tepe is not just a temple, it is a memorial raised by survivors to remember the day the sky fell. Mainstream archaeologists have largely pushed back hard on that interpretation, saying it reads far too much into ambiguous carvings, and that is exactly the kind of argument that could, in principle, be settled by digging up more of the site and recovering more evidence. The tools exist, the site is mapped, the questions are sharp and specific, and yet the digging has, for the most part, stopped. To understand why, we have to follow the story out of the ancient past and into the present day, into a fight involving governments, money, a global conglomerate, and accusations that the oldest temple on Earth is being kept in the ground on purpose. Start with what nobody disputes. Klaus Schmidt, the man who recognized the site and led its excavation for 2 decades, died suddenly in 2014. After his death, the intensive, large-scale digging he had driven for years effectively wound down. Then, in 2016, the management and development of Gobekli Tepe was bound up with a major Turkish business conglomerate, the Dogus Group, as part of a sponsorship and tourism arrangement. And from that point on, the priorities visibly shifted. The focus moved away from aggressive scientific excavation and toward turning the site into a world-class tourist destination, polished, ready for visitors, and ready for inscription on the UNESCO World Heritage List, which it achieved in 2018. To prepare for that, the site got infrastructure, a large protective roof, walkways for tourists, and this is where the public anger erupted. In 2018, photographs and videos started circulating that showed concrete and heavy construction equipment on the site itself. The person who sounded the alarm was not some conspiracy theorist. It was Sigdem Koksal Schmidt, an archaeologist and the widow of Klaus Schmidt, the very man who had given his life to this place. She said her sorrow was hard to put into words, that every time she visited, she saw new damage. She reported that sections of the original wooden walkway were being torn out and replaced with concrete. Other respected archaeologists joined the criticism, warning that heavy machinery and modern materials like concrete had no business being used so close to a fragile, irreplaceable Neolithic site, and that the work, in the words of one of them, looked like a disaster. Officials from the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism and members of the site's own scientific board pushed back, insisting the work was protective rather than destructive, and that nothing was threatening the temple itself. But the images had already gone around the world, and the impression they left was hard to shake. The oldest temple on Earth, with concrete being poured at its edges in the name of tourism. That single controversy might have faded, but it sat on top of a much bigger and far more uncomfortable fact, the one we have already established. Roughly 95% of Göbekli Tepe is still unexcavated, and there appears to be no real plan to change that anytime soon. When the current excavation director, Nekmai Karul, was pressed directly on the future of digging at the site, his answer was striking. He confirmed there is no timeline for fully excavating Göbekli Tepe, and suggested complete excavation might lie as much as 150 years in the future, a century and a half. He defended this by arguing the priority now is conservation and preservation of what has already been uncovered, and that it is wiser to wait for future technologies that will allow less destructive methods of excavation. On the surface, that is a reasonable, even admirable position. Do no harm. Leave something for future generations who may have better tools. The problem is that a lot of archaeologists simply do not buy the justification. They point out that the technologies needed for careful, responsible excavation already exist and have existed for years. Ground-penetrating radar, meticulous manual digging, modern recording, and conservation methods. None of that is science fiction. It is standard practice. So the argument that we have to wait 150 years for better methods strikes many researchers as hollow. From where they stand, the result is plain. The most revolutionary archaeological site on the planet, a site that has already rewritten human history once, sits 95% sealed in the ground, while resources pour into car parks, walkways, and visitor experiences. To these critics, that is not careful stewardship. It is the quiet abandonment of the most important excavation in the world, for reasons that look more economic and political than scientific. The 5% figure is not a one-off complaint either. The Global Heritage Fund and a string of news reports across 2017, 2019, 2020, and 2022 have all repeated essentially the same number. Year after year, almost nothing new comes out of the ground. Critics like to draw a sharp contrast with how other major archaeological sites around the world are treated, where active excavation continues season after season, because that is how knowledge actually advances. At Gobekli Tepe, they argue, the calculation has been quietly reversed. A polished, finished, fully presentable monument under a clean steel roof draws paying tourists from all over the globe and brings in steady revenue. An open, ongoing, chaotic, expensive excavation does not. From that angle, the incentive runs the other way. Manage the site as a destination and leave the discoveries that might disrupt that destination safely in the dark. Whether or not that is the real motive, it is an accusation that is very hard to wave away. And it is into that gap, the gap between the official explanation and the visible reality, that a far more dramatic accusation has rushed. There is a vocal community of alternative researchers who argue that Göbekli Tepe is being kept buried not to protect it, but to suppress it. The best-known voice among them is the writer Graham Hancock, who has argued for years that mainstream archaeology systematically resists evidence that would overturn the conventional timeline of civilization. Hancock and others have publicly condemned the construction at the site and have woven Göbekli Tepe into a larger narrative. In their telling, this place is evidence of a lost, advanced culture from the end of the Ice Age, a culture wiped out by the Younger Dryas catastrophe, whose survivors carried their knowledge to peoples around the world. These ideas reached an enormous global audience through a popular streaming documentary series that put Göbekli Tepe at the center of its lost civilization argument. The reaction from the professional archaeology community was fierce. A major body representing working archaeologists issued a formal public objection, accusing the series of misrepresenting the evidence and of painting scientists as villains conspiring to hide the truth. To them, the suppression story is not just wrong, it is corrosive because it teaches the public that experts are part of a cover-up rather than researchers doing slow, careful, chronically underfunded work. The claim, the alternative researchers say, is that if the full truth were ever proven, it would shatter the accepted story of human progress and embarrass the academic establishment that has defended it. And so, they argue, there are powerful incentives to keep most of the site safely underground, where it cannot produce inconvenient discoveries. It is a gripping story. It is also, and this has to be said plainly, firmly rejected by the great majority of professional archaeologists. The mainstream view is that there is no secret knowledge being hidden, that Gobekli Tepe, astonishing as it is, fits within a revised but still scientific understanding of the Neolithic, and that the real reasons excavation has slowed are far more ordinary. Politics, funding, tourism revenue, bureaucratic caution, national pride, the wish to present a clean, finished attraction rather than an active, messy dig. To put it another way, you do not need a conspiracy to explain why the digging stopped. You only need money, governments, and human nature. But both sides are stuck with the same uncomfortable fact. Whether the motive is preservation, profit, politics, or something darker, the outcome is identical. The site stays buried, the questions stay unanswered, and 95% of the oldest temple on Earth remains exactly where it has been for 11,000 years, in the dark. Which brings us all the way back to where we started, and to the strange symmetry at the heart of this whole story. Gobekli Tepe has now been buried twice. The first time, it was buried by the people who built it. Around 11,000 years ago, they took the monument they had labored to create, filled its great stone circles with earth and rubble and bone, and sealed it beneath an artificial hill, for reasons we still cannot fully explain. Ritual, maybe? Reverence, maybe. An ending they felt they had to perform. And then, in our own time, the site has effectively been buried again. Not with shovels and baskets of soil this time, but with bureaucracy, with concrete, with tourism, and with a decision, stated openly, to leave the vast majority of it untouched for a century or more. The ancient builders had their reasons, the modern custodians have theirs, and in both cases, for everyone standing on the surface, looking down, wondering what is underneath, the result is the same. We do not get to see it. There is one final twist, and it is the kind of detail that makes this whole story stay with you. The reason we have Göbekli Tepe at all, the reason those carvings survived in near-perfect condition across 11,000 years, is precisely because they were buried. If the builders had left their temple exposed, wind, rain, and erosion would have worn the figures down to nothing long before any archaeologist arrived. The burial is what saved it. The dark is what preserved it. So when today's experts argue that leaving the rest of the site in the ground is the safest way to protect it for the future, they may, in a strange way, be right. And the ancient builders may have understood something we are only now relearning, that sometimes the way you protect the most precious things is to bury them. The question that remains is the one no scanner and no AI like Grok can answer. Not what is down there. We already know there is more, far more, waiting under that hill and across that whole region. The real question is whether we or our children or anyone will ever be allowed to bring it back into the light, or whether the oldest temple on Earth will stay sealed in its second grave, holding its secrets, exactly as its builders intended. Göbekli Tepe rewrote the history of civilization using just 5% of itself. Imagine what the other 95% could tell us. An entire buried world of stone giants and carved beasts sits a few feet beneath the surface, mapped, located, and waiting, while the digging stands still and the argument rages on about why. Maybe it is preservation, maybe it is politics and money, maybe, as some insist, it is something they would rather we never find. But the stones are patient. They have already waited 11,000 years. They can wait longer. If a story like this keeps you up at night, the kind where the buried evidence and the official story flatly disagree, then like and subscribe and stick around.